Giving people a moment to file in here. Just another moment for a few more people to join. Okay, great. I think we can get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Audrey Bolus, and I'm the Programs and Communications Associate at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, also known as TIMEP. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our newest virtual panel, hosted in partnership with the Arab Reform Initiative, entitled Cracks in Lebanon's Culture of Impunity, Prospects for Accountability in the Midst of Crisis. Over a year and a half since the unthinkable catastrophe of the Beirut port explosion, those responsible continue to evade justice. As Lebanese officials who've been charged with criminal negligence remain uncooperative and even hostile to the investigation, accountability seems far out of reach. Several figures suspected of complicity in the explosion are even running as candidates in the fast approaching parliamentary elections. This failure of justice is emblematic of a broader issue of political impunity in Lebanon, one that can be traced back to the end of the Civil War, when the parties to the conflict granted themselves a general amnesty and went on to become the country's ruling elite. The clientelist and patronage networks they have created since have spread this impunity throughout the organs of the state and well beyond. Yet, all is not lost. Recent years have seen the emergence of successive movements seeking to crack this wall of impunity. From a broad-based movement to demand an independent judiciary, to efforts by diaspora groups to freeze the assets of corrupt officials outside of Lebanon, efforts to pursue accountability have intensified as Lebanon's collapse has accelerated. Today, our panelists will consider a number of questions, including, can international and domestic movements demanding justice converge, and can they suffice to undermine Lebanon's entrenched culture of impunity? How might these movements for accountability be leveraged to bring about spaces that deliver on transparency, justice, and a system of governance that is responsive to the country's people? Can the parliamentary elections, which in some places have already begun, reinvigorate the role of Parliament as an oversight body? Before we begin, I want to remind our audience that today's conversation is being recorded. You can follow along and live tweet with us using the hashtag #TimeUpEvents. And as audience members, we invite you to submit questions using the Q&A function at any time. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Kareem Chehayeb. Kareem is a journalist reporting on Lebanon and Syria, currently with Al Jazeera English as Beirut correspondent, as well as a former non-resident fellow at TIMEP. Kareem, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you all for joining us today for this timely panel on Lebanon on a subject matter that couldn't be more relevant today, both as its economy continues to spiral and as Lebanese take to the polls in less than a week. It is safe to say that Lebanon has an entrenched culture of impunity. Its judiciary is shackled to the interests of ruling political parties and cronies and is unable to function freely and impartially. And just over the past 2 years, millions of Lebanese wait for any form of accountability and justice, whether it's for decades of systematic financial crimes, their locked savings at the banks, the devastating Beirut port blast, and the recent migrant boat that sunk off the northern city of Tripoli, carrying 80 people. When the authorities open cases, they are either shrouded in secrecy, closed with little information or explanation, or left to collect dust in a storage room for years to come. And notably, during the Beirut port probe, when a judge tries to pursue senior political, security, or business officials, Lebanon's entrenched leadership does everything they can to shut it down. But perhaps there are cracks in Lebanon's wall of impunity. The international community is demanding Lebanon to enact several reforms, including auditing its banks, implementing transparency mechanisms, and making its judiciary independent in exchange for a bailout program. And while Lebanon is resisting the vast majority of these changes, there are also popular movements on the ground, whether it's the Beirut port blast victims' families or the survivors of the Tripoli migrant ship, playing a role to advocate for their cases locally and internationally. And on top of that, there are lawyers both in Lebanon and abroad exerting pressure of their own. And so with that being said, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. We have with us Nadim Houry, the Executive Director of the Arab Reform Initiative, Zena Wakim, international lawyer with Swiss Foundation Accountability Now. Karim Merhej is a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, focusing on corruption, socioeconomic inequality, and governance in Lebanon and Jordan. And finally, Lama Karamé, who is a lawyer and researcher, board member of Beirut-based NGO and research center, The Legal Agenda, and is pursuing her PhD in socio-legal studies at the Faculty of Law at the University of Oxford. So before we get started, just another friendly reminder that if you have any questions, be sure to use the Q&A button on Zoom, and do be sure to address the questions you have to any of our speakers, or several of them, or all of them. Kareem, we will start with you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Karim, for the introductions, and it's a pleasure to be joining all of you here. Okay, so maybe kind of to set the stage, I think when I was reading when I was listening to Karim and Audrey's presentation earlier, I started remembering this show on television in Lebanon back in the mid-2000s. It was called Al Fasad, or Corruption in Arabic. I believe it was on Al Jadid television, and in that show, the host would often show grand revelations of corruption and present evidence on, corruption taking place in so many different sectors, be it counterfeit medicines, corruption in the judiciary, and whatnot. And this sensationalist presentation of corruption or this tradition of sensationalism has quite continued up until the present day, where we still see shows like that on television and even now on social media. And it's quite damning whatever evidence is usually presented, be it audiovisual evidence, written documents, really quite damning. Yet we hardly ever see anyone being held accountable, from low-ranking employees to ministers accused of embezzling millions, if not more. And I always used to think, why is that the case? What's going on? How come this ends up, we see this damning evidence, yet never see any kind of results or any kind of accountability taking place? And to build on what Karim was saying earlier, this goes back to the political, economic, and financial order that has come into being after the end of the Civil War, and more specifically after the first post-war elections in September 1992. So the story has become quite known for now, but it's always worth repeating, whereby, the warlords of the war, who committed some of the worst atrocities and crimes imaginable, ended up giving themselves a general amnesty, and they became the ministers. They became the ones who governed after the war. And of course, you had some billionaire businessmen who also were excited about the prospects of making a profit in Lebanon, who joined the game. And of course, Lebanon was under stewardship, I would say, or quasi-occupation by the Syrian regime at the time. So what ended up happening is that let's say, the theoretical framework to view the post-war order was, I believe one author called it the spoils sharing system, whereby the different warlords, they saw the Lebanese state as their spoils of the war, whereby each one would carve out his own little niche in the state, plunder public funds, redistribute them to their own constituents in one way or another. Another author, I believe it was Kamal Hamdan, the economist, who described it as a breadcrumb system, whereby these warlords would deliberately ensure that the state would never give social services, be it education, healthcare, etc. And they would use the state and public funds to entrench their sectarian clientelistic networks. And of course, how did the state make any money? Or the state was spending much more than it was making in revenues, not just due to the corruption and the plundering and the fact that we don't know what was happening at the port of Beirut all of those years and how much the state was making money off taxes and customs there, but also because the state needed to make more money, needed the money to feed these networks of clientelism. So where did this money come from? The public debt. This is where the debt started ballooning and to catastrophic levels starting in the 1990s after the war. And you had those treasury bonds that were issued at very high interest rates. And who bought those treasury bonds? It was essentially the commercial banks. And who owns the commercial banks? It's essentially the ruling elites, the politicians, their relatives, their friends in the private sector. And this is not a secret, just read their annual reports. You look at who are the shareholders, the banks, it's quite well known. So that's how the banks made their profit. And the banks, they invested their money in, consumer loans, like buy cars and like for people to buy cars and whatnot, rather than investing them in sectors of the economy that could contribute to, could create good jobs and lead to Lebanon exporting services or goods and whatnot. And so this was basically in a nutshell, the kind of monstrous, if you want, political, economic, and financial order that came into being after the war. The system built on impunity and lack of any kind of accountability, where despite the countless corruption scandals that have come to the fore since back then, the 1990s, all of the different newspapers covered them. As I mentioned on television, we've always seen these, big reports being done. No one was ever held to account except one minister, I believe it was in 1999. It was an exception to the norm, really. And everyone, all of the ruling elites made profits off the state, off the people. And this, if you want, order collapsed, I believe you can say in August 2019, when the currency, the Lebanese lira, which was pegged to the dollar since 1997, the peg was no longer sustainable for a wide variety of reasons, which I don't think I have the time to go into. But basically, this is the order that has collapsed right now. And Lebanon is currently at a crossroads, as the introduction mentioned. Are we seeing cracks in the system of impunity, and what chances do we have? What kind of opportunities exist? Now's the time to ask these questions and to really examine what we can do. And on this note, I think I'll conclude.
Thank you so much, Karim, for laying the foundation of why you have such an entrenched culture of impunity here. And I think you ended on a very important note. Is there really an opportunity for us to break through this wall or through this obstacle? And I think this is where I'd like to speak, or we'd like to hear from Lama Karamé, given that one of the important reforms that have been being pushed outside of the economic sector restructuring is the independence of the judiciary. There's a draft law. The draft law went through lots of recommendations for civil society, but it's sort of been gathering dust in Parliament. So we'd like to hear more about that. And does it have potential to break this wall of impunity?
Yeah, thank you, Karim, and thank you for inviting me for this panel. I think you're talking about judicial independence, and interestingly, this week, if you look at all political programs, electoral programs of all candidates, you see that judicial independence is a common thread in all programs. So I think it's a common agreement that judicial independence is needed and is crucial at this stage. The Beirut blast investigation and the financial collapse, but also the use of the law as a tool of oppression to protesters, against protesters during the uprising, have all emphasized the role of the judiciary, but have also shown the need for an independent judiciary, especially in cases where public prosecutors have been aligned with the interests of the regime and have been defending the interests of the regime. So regarding the law on the independence and transparency of the judiciary, it's a draft law that has been prepared by the legal agenda after years and years of research, and it has been presented to the Parliament by 9 of its members in September 2018. It was presented in 2018. Obviously, we've had rosy promises that it will be discussed promptly. However, the draft was sidelined and only gained momentum in 2019 with the uprising, and it was put on the schedule of the Administration and Justice Committee in December 2019. So the importance of the draft is that it shifted the discourse from one that is centered around the morality of individual judges, one that sees the problem of judicial independence as one relating to individual judges, to a discourse that acknowledges and recognizes the need for systemic reforms and structural reforms in the judiciary, ones that are based on objective standards. So the law, in a sense, provided a tangible meaning for the independence of justice, and thus shifted it from the populist slogans, I would say. The initial draft included very important provisions that would weaken the grip of politicians on the judiciary, either by strengthening the independence of judicial institutions such as the Inspection Department, the Supreme Justice Council. It guarantees essential freedoms for judges, such as the right to assembly, the right to freedom of speech. It also included provisions that would reform the inspection and the disciplinary procedures of judges, and provisions that would ensure a fair and transparent procedure for the appointment of judges. The law also tackled the issue of public prosecutors. Public prosecutors have a very sensitive judicial position that has played a pivotal role in the prosecution of crimes, and it has been traditionally a tool for the most blatant interferences and interventions in the judiciary. The law also addressed the practice of reserving key judicial positions for particular sects, thus leading to the institutionalization of patronage and clientelism, and included provisions that guarantee the equality of judges in appointment. The committee that studied the bill starting 2019 and ended in 2021 obviously lacked transparency and a clear methodology of work. And despite recurrent calls to its president, MP George Adwan, discussions were not open to the public. So it's no surprise that the final product, or the bill that has been produced by this committee, has distorted the initial draft and included many contradictions, loopholes, and it has inconsistently applied certain standards, but rejected others. In many aspects, the law seems to have adopted international standards, yet allowed for expensive exceptions that would render it basically meaningless. And we can talk about this a bit later. Just to go back to your question, yes, the law on judicial independence is a key component of the said reform laws, but we do have very legitimate concerns that the regime would use this law to legally whitewash its crimes. And there is a risk of enacting a cosmetic reform, an empty and void law, just to gain legitimacy among international donors. And this is something that the regime has done repeatedly and is really good at doing. To wrap up, the battle for judicial independence cannot be separated, and the battle for judicial independence in the question of immunities, but also broadly, cannot be separated from the broader sociopolitical and economic context. Today, we cannot talk about judicial independence if we cannot answer the question that how can you even ensure judicial independence in courts that don't have electricity, that lack the very basic infrastructure? How can we ensure the continuity of the public sector amidst the financial collapse? So if we don't address these pressing questions, I think the law is likely to remain ink on paper. And just to link it rapidly with the broader theme of this webinar on breaking the cycle of impunity, I think we can all agree that enacting laws and enacting more laws will not lead to breaking the cycle of immunity. I think the Beirut blast investigation, but also the investigations in financial crimes, we can talk a bit more about this later, but both of these cases have shown that the strongest shield for accountability in Lebanon is actually sectarianism. It's not only laws, it's entrenched sectarianism. So it's important, once we want to really attempt to break the cycle of impunity, also to consider ways of challenging the core interests of the sectarian regime. Thank you, Karim.
Thank you so much, Lama. And I think what's interesting is what Zena will bring now, considering that, you know, the financial crimes that are happening in Lebanon are not only being investigated locally, but internationally as well. And accountability now has been probing Central Bank Governor Riyad Salemi for a host of financial crimes. So Zena, you know, using your efforts with the Swiss Riyad Salemi probe, could you expand on how this impunity also exists, not just locally, but also it extends into international efforts to holding people to account?
Yes, thank you, Kareem. So, this persistent problem of impunity is not only local and Lebanese related. It's not only due to the muzzling of the judiciary and to tactics to circumvent accountability in Lebanon, but it's due to many other factors. The first one that I can think of is the conflict of interest of the Western world to hold Lebanese PEPs accountable, for their crimes of corruption. And the fact is that corruption touches on questions of national interest for those countries. And all of them have sheltered, most of them in Europe have sheltered ill-gotten assets. So there is therefore very little will in Europe to open a Pandora box and shed light on either passive complicity or active assistance in laundering corruption money. If we just look at Switzerland, for example, and that relates to the Riyad Salameh case, it raises the question of the role played by Swiss banks in sheltering Lebanese corruption money. In Mr. Salameh case, we have over $500 million of transactions that transited through Swiss bank accounts. How come banks have not raised any red flags? And I would like to just read the note of the public prosecutor in Switzerland, which shows this culture of impunity extended to Swiss banks as well. And he says, the explanations provided by the banks in the context of their due diligence obligation show contradictory information with respect to the wealth of Mr. Salameh in view of the estimate nature and origin of his funds. So that is for Switzerland. Now, if we look at the UK, London has been a long time destination for dirty money, and the National Crime Agency in London, in the UK, estimates to some $125 billion a year dirty money flowing in the UK. So that is a question of national interest for the UK. Would they really want to tackle corruption and prosecute crimes of corruption? Let's look at France. So the close ties between French leaders and former French colonies were until recently an absolute bar to any enforcement action implicating their friends, no matter how corrupt they were. So, the first factor for me that makes this problem more persistent than it already is this conflict of interest of the Western world. The second one is the fact that Lebanese politicians hold enormous political power. We know that, but then it's used to put pressure on prosecutors, and also it's used to put pressure on media to discourage the coverage of the issues at stake. We have seen it at the level of the foundation. When we filed a complaint in Switzerland against Lebanese banks who assisted Mr. Salameh in the suspected embezzlement of funds, no media in Lebanon accepted to cover this action. And why is that? It was discussed just a bit earlier, because 15 of the largest banks in Lebanon are controlled directly or indirectly by politicians. So that makes this problem even more persistent. And we also have witnessed the reluctance of the media at a much earlier stage in the process. So when we initiated the proceeding against Mr. Salameh, very few media accepted to cover this action. And well, that is also explained by the massive injection of cash made by the central bank into some media outlets in Lebanon. And why would they then want to expose the crimes of their benefactor? And the third thing, which we experienced also firsthand, is and which explains this persistent problem of impunity, is that Lebanese politicians are extremely wealthy and they have enormous financial power to fund their retaliation actions. It's very easy for them to spend big money to discourage their opponents, to lead intimidation campaign, to harass and discredit those exposing their crimes. We've experienced that. They are also very good at launching numerous legal proceedings for slander, and just for the only purpose to create financial black holes and to exhaust financially those fighting to end impunity. Not every activist can pay legal advisors or fend off legal motions for slander. So that also, the fact that there are deep pockets explains also this persistent problem of impunity. But there is a last factor, which is very important. We rarely talk about it in Lebanon. It's not legal, it's not financial, it's not political, it's human. And that really pertains to Lebanon. We commonly say that Lebanon is a village where everybody knows everyone and where each taxi driver is a political analyst. So the particulars of Lebanon are such that somehow we all know somebody who knows a politician or somebody who's involved in corruption. So many people seem to be part of a web which supports a politician or a religious party. So in whose interest it is actually to effectively and efficiently fight corruption, that is not only for Lebanon, but also for Lebanese abroad as well, for leaders abroad, for French politicians, in whose interest is it really to fight corruption and hold Lebanese politicians accountable for their crimes of corruption. So I just wanted, to explain these four factors which add to the problem. It's not only a Lebanese problem, it's also like an international, well, I would say lack of political will internationally to end impunity in Lebanon.
Thank you so much, Zena, for your insight. I'd like to move on to Nadim right now, Nadim Houry. We sort of got an idea of the dynamics that kind of take place both locally in Lebanon and internationally. How can this, both locally, internationally, kind of converge to crack this, this wall of impunity, and I think we've talked a lot about Beirut Blast Probe, Riyadh Saleh Probe, and with groups like the committees of families, whether it's for the Beirut port blast victims, relatives, or sort of this more recent manifestation of the survivors of the Tripoli migrant ship, is there a role for this kind of activism on the ground as well, this grassroots mobilization to support efforts to break this wall? What do you think?
Well, definitely, and I think previous speakers have described it very well, how entrenched impunity has become, not only in the political and economic system, but even in the whole, I think, societal order after the war. I think Karim Merhej was talking about the, Spoils of Truce, which was a Renaud Linder's book, which really describes that this is the kind of the basis of the post-war order. And maybe for a long time, the mistake many of us who had hoped to kind of fight corruption or push for accountability were doing, we sort of thought, okay, if you just kind of keep on one issue, you sort of manage to win. And then you kind of realize there are so many layers to it. And in Lebanon, we've had the experience back in the mid-2000s, and given the complexity, people said, okay, we're just going to create this special tribunal for Lebanon to investigate this one crime. And somehow we outsourced the problem. Well, that was an abysmal failure. And then there was a reaction of saying, if we just work locally, and obviously you need to work locally, and there's been a lot of work being done on kind of raising awareness. We better understand the problem today than we ever have. But then you realize, and I think Zena was describing it very well, that this actually corruption does not stop at the borders of Lebanon. And actually that, you cannot hold them accountable because many of these politicians are also gaining some of their strength and hiding some of their money outside the borders. So you need to think of it as, in French, there's a great word, convergence des luttes. You have to see a convergence of different types of struggles and campaigns. And here I just want to add something. I don't think you can overturn impunity in Lebanon in one go. It's not like a cartoon where suddenly two merge and we get massive ball of fire and suddenly you breach the wall. No, I like to think of it, you're going to have to chip at the wall of impunity. It's going to have to be a slow, long process. And I often call it like, we have to have a guerrilla approach to accountability. Not that it means not being violent, but the idea that what's the guerrilla tactic? You try to undermine a stronger enemy through long, low intensity confrontation. You pick your battle, you harass them, you come at them from different directions. So I think this is what needs to happen. You need to come at them in Lebanon. And if you're blocked in Lebanon, you try to see if you can get at them internationally. And one of the things, the major developments in the last few years, particularly in the last 3 years, is we're finally starting to see the diaspora playing a role. So it's not just international institutions, it's Lebanese bringing lawsuits, in Switzerland, in the UK, in France. But you also need to link it to a broader discourse around accountability, which I think is something that, Legal Agenda has done a fantastic work in, and there's a lot more awareness about the structure nature of it. And in this, to go back to your question about the role of victims, in this, if you want, ecosystem that is chipping at the wall of impunity, the victims are at the heart of the process. they play an essential role because in a way, they are the moral compass. They become the sort of value. If you kind of put them as the anchor, as the lodestar, then that gives a big power. But having said that, we also need to be careful they should be at the heart of the process. Their voice should be, and it goes from the victims of the explosions, it goes to the exploited migrant domestic workers, it goes to women who are victims of domestic violence. All these have to have, it's a form of empowerment for them to be heard. But we also need to be careful that they are not the only ones, bilwajha, as we say in Arabic, the only ones to kind of have the blowback from the regime, because we saw what the regime would do. We saw what the regime has done to some of the families of the port blast, pressuring them, creating divisions. So we also, this is the irony. They need to be at the center of the process. They need to be empowered. There can be no justice if they're not at the center of the process. And yet we need to imagine spaces and processes to also protect and embrace them as part of this broader movement, this broader guerrilla warfare.
Thank you so much, Nadim. And just a quick reminder before we continue to everybody who is with us on Zoom, you can send us questions and make sure to address it to one or more speakers that you have. And you can also follow up with live tweets at #TIMEP events, #ARI events. Lama, I'd like to go back to you. So we've heard a lot about different efforts that have taken place locally, internationally, through institutions or through diaspora or through grassroots initiatives. But I think it would be interesting to also now hear about what are the legal and judicial tactics that Lebanon uses to circumvent any forms of accountability. Because you have people on the ground looking for, supporting the Beirut probe. You have legal investigations, local, international, trying to probe into the central bank governor, into all sorts of cases. But then how is the judiciary in Lebanon used to circumvent all these things and to keep things stalling as they are right now?
Yeah, so I think as Nadim and Karim have rightly mentioned, impunity is an inherent feature of the post-war regime. And one of the main ingredients of this impunity is the systemic weakening of the justice sector. So if the most obvious example is that if we look at the budget allocated to the Ministries of Justice in the recurrent government, we see that the budget of the Ministry of Justice is excessively lower than that of other ministries, notably, for example, ministries of defense or ministries that fund security forces, such as the Ministry of Interior. So there is a systematic goal to weaken this justice sector. And that's why I think it's a bit, there are no easy answers as to the role that the judiciary has played, because although, yes, the judiciary has been complicit in its support of the culture of impunity, it has also been a victim of it. Over the last 2 years, we've seen how the regime has deployed a plethora of legal strategies to obstruct justice, namely in the two crimes of the century, the Beirut blast investigation, but also in all legal proceedings related to the financial collapse. And if you allow me here, the Legal Agenda has published a book edited by my colleague Rida Frangieh that provides a thorough compilation of the different aspects of immunity, starting from the immunity of political crimes to personal crimes, and I would encourage everyone to read it. But I would like to talk only briefly about three main aspects of legal techniques that were used by the regime to avoid accountability. The first technique is that of the removal or transfer of what I would like to say the disobedient judges, and by disobedient I mean disobedient to the regime. So the law allows any party to a lawsuit to request the removal of the judge from the case under certain conditions, including where there are legitimate doubts over the neutrality of the judge. This argument has been used to remove Judge Fadi Sawan based on a request submitted by two ministers, Ali Hassan Khalil and Ghazi Zaited, who argued that Sawan is not neutral and is biased. The Court of Cassation approved the request and argued that Sawan lacks neutrality, first because he challenged the immunities, and secondly, which is very ironic, is because Sawan is personally or has been personally injured in a sense by the blast because his house was damaged. So this is a very expensive interpretation of neutrality. The attempt to remove judges did not stop with the removal of Sawan. We know since the appointment of Judge Bitar, there had been more than 20 requests to remove the judge, each time presented by a different minister in different courts, and it's a maze that is very complicated at this stage. But basically, the investigation has been suspended for over 4 months now, because with every request to remove the judge, by law, the judge has to halt the investigation. So the investigation has been suspended for 4 months now because the Minister of, to explain it briefly, currently because the court that should judge or should hear the case lacks the quorum, which is the plenary assembly of the Court of Cassation. And the finance minister, Yusuf Khalil, who is close to the Amal movement, has arbitrarily refused to sign the draft decree to appoint new judges to the Court of Cassation. So he's currently suspending the investigation. And this is another reminder of how the judicial independence relates to our daily battles, I would say. And this is something that we've seen also in cases relating to banks. So back to the Swiss probe, we've seen how Judge Jean Tannous, who had taken a decision to raid 6 banks to obtain information about the suspicious transfers related to this case. Judge Tannous was removed from this case while he was at the bank, while he was executing the raid. And he was removed by an order by the General Prosecutor, Ghassan Awaidat. And this is obviously not the first time that Judge Awaidat uses his hierarchical power to stop ongoing investigations against the regime. The second pillar, I will be very quick, is the obstruction of justice by the invocation of immunities. I will spare you the technicalities and the legal jargon, but this is just to say that there are different forms of immunities that have been invoked in the blast investigation, including presidential, ministerial, parliamentary immunities, but also the immunities of public servants, judges, and lawyers. Some of these immunities can be dismissed, but it remains a very dangerous field for accountability, not only in the Beirut blast, but also in most corruption cases against officials. Riyad Salameh has also invoked immunity, and unfortunately, the Court of Cassation in September 2021 has approved his request, claiming that he does have immunity in cases related to the violation of the Code of Money and Credit, and thus requires the approval of the central bank to prosecute Riyad Salameh. So imagine this: Riyad Salameh needs to approve his own prosecution. The third legal mechanism that they have used is the blatant or outright non-execution of judicial orders. As you have rightly mentioned, as we speak, there is an active warrant against Ali Hassan Khalil and Ghazi Zaited, both of whom are running for elections. But again, a parallel also can be drawn in financial cases. Judge Ghadaoun has issued a subpoena against Riyad Salameh because he failed to attend consecutive hearings, and the subpoena hasn't been executed. One very last thing, these legal maneuvers run in parallel to an equally dangerous extrajudicial discourse, which is based on delegitimizing the work of the judge, accusing them of politicization, going as far as character assassination, and dividing families of the victims along sectarian lines, violence threats, etc. But in both files, just to go back to the idea of sectarianism, in both files, we have also seen the invocation of a pseudo-sectarian immunity. So when Minister Hassan Diab was charged, Nahad al-Mashnou his former opponent defended him, saying and defied authorities and said, if you want to prosecute Hassan Diab or if you want to notify him, come to Dar al-Fatwa. But Riyad also allocated an entire Sunday sermon to defend Riyad Salameh. So this is back to sectarianism as a field of accountability. Thank you, and sorry for speaking a lot.
No, thank you so much, Lama. These are such crucial examples, and it shows how there's so many different ways to sort of snake through accountability, by even falling back to your own religious institution, which shows really how hijacked the judiciary is in Lebanon. I think outside of that, there has been some interesting accountability legislation and mechanisms that currently exist in Lebanon, relatively new ones, the anti-corruption law, whistleblower protection law, the more recent illicit enrichment law. And these are things that, civil society organizations and some international organizations have been sort of pressuring Lebanon to do for a while. Karim, I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about these mechanisms in the sense that, are these opportunities for accountability in Lebanon to sort of change that trend? Is this legislation perhaps something that chips at that wall of impunity, or are there setbacks that come with having this legislation as well? We'd like to hear from you about that, please.
Yeah, after listening to all of the different speakers, an average listener might be surprised to find out that in the last really 5 or 6 years, the parliament has passed quite a few anti-corruption laws that on paper are quite good, really. Like if you read them, there's the anti-access to information law, the whistleblower protection law, a law on transparency in the oil and gas sector. And if you want the node linking all of these different laws is something called the National Anti-Corruption Commission, which is the law to establish this commission was passed in, I believe, May 2020, so a few months after the uprising. And the law stipulates that within 3 months, this commission should be established. And the commission was established only in, I believe, February 2022, so a year and a half after the law was passed. And I believe this little, anecdote illustrates how we should think about these anti-corruption laws in general. As Lama mentioned earlier, the idea of passing laws, they can be great laws, but they might remain simply ink on paper. Like passing the laws is not the only way through which, or is not the only, solution to fight impunity or to bring about some accountability in our country. And as a matter of fact, I would argue that sometimes, especially these laws, the anti-corruption laws, are passed definitely not out of a concern to actually fight corruption and bring more transparency in the Lebanese state, but more out of a way to dangle or to kind of polish the image of the Lebanese ruling elites, or kind of a way to dangle a carrot in front of the so-called international community to try to say, look, we are making reforms, we are passing these laws, and so give us money, give us more loans. And this was the case before the SAD conference of 2018, when right before parliamentary elections, several donor states pledged $11 billion, mainly in loans to Lebanon, and on the condition that reforms would be enacted. So some of these reforms being anti-corruption laws being passed. So in a nutshell, these laws, despite how good they are on paper, we are not seeing any kind of proper implementation. And as a matter of fact, in some instances, these laws are being, it's difficult to conceive of their implementation. Take the Whistleblower Protection Law, for example. The law stipulates that the commission that I just mentioned should protect whistleblowers, should offer them incentives and rewards if they submit, information, they leak data related to corruption and whatnot. But in Lebanon, in the last few years, we've seen a few mysterious, if you want, assassinations that have taken place, and we haven't seen any kind of accountability. I remember 2 years ago, there was the head of, I believe, the compliance department in Biblos Bank, who was assassinated in the parking lot of his building. And nobody remembers him. Nobody remembers what happened to him. The only one article in the Financial Times kind of covered it well. Rather than that, nobody remembers. There was a photographer with the Lebanese army who died under similar mysterious circumstances, etc. So even if you have a law to protect whistleblowers, what ends up, is the law going to be implemented, or are they going to face any kind of severe challenges or worse, obvious pressure and whatnot? So, and the commission itself, I mentioned it was established in February 2022. I mean, the names in the 6-member commission isn't very reassuring, I would say, especially if we look at the background of the president of the commission. He's a judge who previously served as the public prosecutor in North Lebanon. As Lama mentioned, the judiciary in Lebanon is heavily sectarianized, and you have all sorts of strangulation over judges, while judges, at least the ethical judges or whatever, and judges who are much more compliant with the ruling elites and who kind of turn a blind eye, they're the ones who usually get, they get the perks. So this commission, which we still don't know how its administrative structure is going to be, we don't know how much funds will be allocated to it, because in the last 2 years, the government hasn't passed, or the parliament hasn't voted on a budget. So we really shouldn't, I think, pin too much high hopes on the Anti-Corruption Commission or these new anti-corruption laws, or even the anti-corruption strategy that was passed, I believe, in 2020 by, I believe it was Demianos Khattar, who was the Minister of State for Administrative Reform, who had pushed for its passing. It was adopted by the government. So I think these kinds of anti-corruption laws and the strategy, as great as they are on paper, we shouldn't really pin too much hopes on them. However, I want to go back to a really nice sentence Nadim said, la convergence des luttes, or how different struggles have to converge to bring about this kind of end to impunity. Because as Nadim also said, we can't stop impunity in one single strike. We can't imagine, like, I don't know, a dictator coming, like a Napoleon Bonaparte kind of coming and reforming everything. And unfortunately, I remember there was some discourse like this during the uprising of saying we want a military coup, we want the commander-in-chief of the armed forces to take power and fight the corrupt people. I mean, we can ask our friends in Egypt how did that work out. So we can see these anti-corruption laws as a way for us, as part of this convergence of struggles, especially the access to information law, because this law itself is extremely important because it allows us, everyday citizens, the public, researchers, writers, etc., to request information, especially financial data, from state institutions. And some institutions are actually complying by the law, to give credit where it's due. And Karim and I have even used this law on several occasions where we managed to obtain information that was quite sensitive and crucial. And when institutions refuse to comply with the law, this also tells us something, like what are they hiding? So, and on this note, I'll conclude my statement.
Thank you, Karim. And yes, it's true. There have been some institutions that have complied with the access to information, others who certainly haven't. With that being said, I'd like to move on to Zena and, of course, the international sort of element of these probes to break the wall of impunity. Lebanon has been cooperating very much. It's very clear. But what can be done? Is there a way to push Lebanon to cooperate with international legal efforts? Or are we just doomed to kind of have these obstacles in front of us?
Thank you, Karim. So the first thing is that we need to define who is Lebanon to answer this question. There is no such thing as Lebanon, which is separate from the individuals who run the country. So requesting criminals to hand over evidence which will expose their own crimes might actually not happen. It might not be the best methodology to request cooperation from Lebanon or from the individuals from the ruling elite. So the real question is therefore not, in my view, how to push Lebanon to cooperate, but is cooperation really necessary? Do we really need the Lebanese authorities to cooperate to hold PEPs accountable? And the answer, in my view, is no. The largest portion of corruption money is not held in Lebanon, it's held abroad. It sits on bank accounts in Switzerland, in Singapore, in Panama. It's been invested in real estate in the UK, in Monaco, France. So it's therefore perfectly possible for the countries of the place of location of the assets to launch their own investigations and eventually confiscate all ill-gotten assets even the more so when mutual legal assistance has failed. We have seen that done in the past with Duvalier, so the Haitian dictator. Switzerland could not get mutual assistance from Haiti, and they just confiscated the funds without any cooperation being requested from Haiti. In the case of Hosni Mubarak, the Swiss justice authorities initiated also their own criminal proceedings, regardless of any cooperation with Egypt, and they froze $570 million of assets. So similar steps were also taken with Bashar al-Assad. There is no cooperation with Syria, obviously, yet all assets were frozen, travel bans were issued, and trade restrictions were also issued. So we do not need to push the Lebanese authorities to cooperate. We rather need European countries to take their responsibilities, to take action to tackle corruption and money laundering, which is happening on their territories. So, but that's a political question. It's not a legal one. There are laws that would enable each country in Europe to confiscate Lebanese corruption money, and yet it is not done.
Thank you so much, Zena. And Nadim, you talked about sort of this guerrilla kind of tactic to take on impunity. How could we empower and fortify, strong position for these more grassroots kind of stakeholders in legal cases? And of course, the biggest example, the most organized example, is the Beirut port blast family. And I guess also just sort of to kind of wrap things up, really, when we talk about Lebanon recovering from its institutional and economic collapse, it's not just about, fixing its electricity sector or, restructuring its banks. It's also about really, putting together the proper accountability and legal and administrative reforms as well, if we want to have a viable recovery in Lebanon. I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. And please go ahead.
Thank you. These are two very important questions. One, so what is at stake in Lebanon, and what's collapsing, and what should be saved, and how it can be saved? I think these are very challenging questions. So for me, there are two scenarios. One scenario is the regime, because it's a regime in place, has to make some changes, right? Because it's bankrupt, not because it wants to. We'll have to make some changes, but these changes will remain cosmetic. So they will just do enough changes to pass laws that they don't implement, or they might sacrifice the lower echelons. What's interesting is, to this point, they haven't even sacrificed their lower echelons. One would have expected that, but this shows you how, it's like the mafia. They're still holding. They're not letting go of their guys. But maybe if some of them start falling, we'll see some of that. But what you can do in that scenario, that's a scenario, they survive in one form or another. What you can hope for, if you're going to use, again, it's a non-violent guerrilla tactic I'm pushing for, is maybe you try to claim some spaces, symbolic important spaces. And I think this is where professional syndicates have an important role to play. This is where, so maybe the, union of the pharmacists clean up their act, so they know each other. They know each other very well as a corporation. They know who are the ones that are really corrupt. And they start a bit creating a sense of kind of, cleaning their profession of the worst practices, imposing laws. That's one way I think you kind of, you start creating islands where, kind of, if you, again, islands where kind of corruption and sectarianism have been fought, if you cannot have the full change. In parallel, I think, what's really going to be important is whether we see the lawyers syndicate in Lebanon, the Beirut and the Tripoli Bar Association themselves become real actors for fighting this impunity. And we've seen some efforts. They haven't led to, I think we had higher expectations from what was going to happen. It didn't fully happen. But, we always talk about the judiciary, but I can tell you the legal profession in Lebanon has also become profoundly corrupt. The number of lawyers who actually act as go-between between judges and accused, and they openly, I've happened to be sitting in some judges' offices and a lawyer hands them an envelope from someone else. This is their job, they're middlemen. If the Bar Association itself doesn't start taking the initiative, there's really no hope for change. So I think, again, what's encouraging, because I do think what's encouraging is we are seeing more and more of these guerrilla tactics in more and more spaces. Even some of the music and the comedy that's very irreverent these days, that's also a way of fighting impunity. Because how can you fight impunity when you have people who still say sometimes, my children fada semayit zaim, like I'm willing to sacrifice my children for the shoe of my warlord or my zaim. If that's the case, then there's no way you're going to put that person in jail, even if you prove they're corrupt. I mean, you have someone in front of you who symbolically is saying that. So by breaking the image of the zaim, by breaking these things, you are contributing to preparing the groundwork for potential accountability. So I just want to say, for me, it's really it's a broad range effort that goes from cultural initiative to actual draft laws, to small local initiatives, to empowering medium level actors. So I think these are all very, very important. And as you win some battles, I think that's what's going to be hard, is can you consolidate? So if the Beirut port is being rebuilt, can it be rebuilt in a way where that local administration becomes more transparent? Because again, it was built to be corrupt on purpose. I mean, and this is not me just saying that, actually the way they assigned powers and authorities in the Beirut port was done on purpose so that no one can ever be held accountable. And then the explosion happened. So, and then finally, just on the notion of, how can these initiatives be supported? I think one, yes, they can be supported by society embracing them. And we've seen that with the Beirut families. I mean, now we're starting to see maybe a bit less attention, but it's important. The media, societies can stand by them. Other forms, again, I think these intermediary bodies should stand by them. The lawyers, the doctors, the syndicates, the workers should kind of shield these victims. And again, use the victim. We have actually no memorial for victims in Lebanon. In our narrative, they don't exist. But by rewriting them at the center of the narrative, of any other narrative, of the narrative of reconstruction, it is actually paving the way for potential accountability. The road is going to be long because, frankly, the cancer has metastasized to every single element of our body at this stage. And we need to fight this image of a general can come and they can clean house. Who appointed this general? I mean, didn't we have enough generals? Our last 3 presidents were all from the army. I mean, so I think we still need some ways to go to kind of counter this image that somehow one person can come and fix everything when that person themselves are issued from that system.
Thanks, Nadim. And yeah, it is a really long road. And as you said, the cancer has sort of spread and it's going to take a while. I guess we're going to start taking questions now. Thank you all so much for these valuable insights and interventions. One question was from Jodor, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. Basically, during the 2001 economic and political crisis in Argentina, protesters took to the streets to request the resignation of all politicians. Private banks blocked depositors from accessing their savings, and the economy ministry abandoned the fixed exchange currency policy and applied a 50% devaluation. The judicial power held no one accountable from the previous corruption and socioeconomic consequences. 20 years later, little has changed. That's very grim. My question is, can elections, legal reforms, or international pressure bring any changes to the Lebanese political landscape, economic policies, and legal practices developed throughout the post-war period? And this is for everybody. So whoever would like to jump in, please go ahead. Can elections change anything? The elections are on Sunday.
It's not alone. I think you need to have and. So it's not elections or international pressure on legal reforms. I would add to that domestic pressure, organizing, long-haul efforts. If you put an and instead of an or, then we maybe stand a chance. Is it complicated? Yes. Have we seen some examples of countries that have turned things? Yes. Will Lebanon have to be creative in how we think about these issues? Yes. We have the sectarian. I think it was Lama who talked about it. I mean, that's a special kind of, we have an extra level of obstacle in Lebanon. There's that sectarian trump card. When they get accused, they go hide behind their patriarch, their mufti. That they don't have in Argentina. So that's an extra level for us. But we can find ways. And I have to say, I've been amazed by People are breaking the taboos one after the other. The problem, frankly, the real problem is the economic collapse is so harsh that time is sometimes feel like a luxury. So as you build momentum to deal with yesterday's problem, you have a new problem. So I think about families of the disappeared. They finally started building momentum for their cause. Okay, the port blast happens. Now you have everyone is an economic victim. But I think the only way to overcome this, that we're not always playing catch up, is to find ways where these different struggles find a way to work together and build on each other. A cumulative process, easier said than done, but I think essential.
Thanks, Nadim. Anyone else would like to jump in? Karim? Lama.
Yeah, just very quickly to add on what Nadim's saying, I think what we've been witnessing in the last decade, at least, since I don't want to adopt the teleological kind of Hegelian view of history, but I think in the last decade, we've seen this kind of growth, if you want, or emergence of an anti-sectarian, or let's say secular alternative in the Lebanese, in Lebanon itself, and right now among the diaspora. And this is cause for some cautious optimism, I would say, because we're seeing some political organizing that's taking place, especially in the last 2-3 years, at least maybe since 2015, I would say. And obviously, going back to what Nadim was saying, there are many different fronts we're going to have to fight. And, culture, music, comedy, these are great. And also there's the media landscape. The media landscape in Lebanon is so horrible because it's all owned by these different ruling elites, and they can all easily be bought on the cheap. We all know that. So there's also work to be done on that front, especially when it comes to investigative journalism. So in a nutshell, what I want to add is the fight is very long, and it has to be built also on a political project. And this project has to be secular, anti-sectarian, and have, at least personally, I think it needs to have a leftist component. It has to be anchored in social justice. I mean, 80% of the population is in poverty. We've seen the monstrous inequalities, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. So we are seeing some changes. There's maybe some cause for a bit of cautious optimism. Maybe next week we'll have, after the elections and after the ballots are counted, with the hopes that we won't see any, scandals take place. We might hopefully see some little surprises. I'm not too hopeful, but we'll see. And yeah, I think Lama had her hand up.
I mean, I'm not hopeful either, but that's another thing. No, the only thing I wanted to add is the idea actually that Karim has mentioned in inscribing activism within a political project. So even if we had legal reforms, and this is something that we've been discussing today, legal reforms need to be inscribed in a political project to be effective, because lawmaking is not only a question for technocrats. It's not only a question of legal expertise. There are political choices that need to be made within lawmaking. We've seen this, for example, in the capital control laws, and the list goes on. So making laws just for legal reform can be counterproductive. Today, there is a question of who is paying the price of the collapse, who needs to pay the price of the losses. And this is not a technical legal question that can be solved by the best legal experts. It needs a political project. And this brings me back to elections. Of course, we don't have a choice but to hope for change through elections. But I think we can all agree that power in Lebanon is not negotiated in elections. It's negotiated within between sectarian leaders. So the power of the parliament is really, I mean, at least it's not compliant with the democratic processes. That's the least I can say. And I mean, the legal agenda has documented the practices of the parliament and the practices of Nabih Berri and how laws are made in the parliament. I don't think it's very promising, or it gives any hope of change through legal reform. And just one quick note on Nadim's point on the Beirut Bar Association and the Tripoli Bar Association and the role of legal professions. So indeed, legal professions in Lebanon have been supporters of the regime for a long time. We've seen a bit of I would say, a breach during the uprising with the election of a pro-revolutionary president of the bar. But if we look at the policies of the bar, we see how all policies are actually very liberal. So although the bar did support, for example, the right of protesters or the judicial independence, so the liberal rights, it has been very lenient, or it has been very reluctant in questions relating to economic reform. So we've seen the bar defend the liberal economic model of Lebanon. So I also think this is something to keep an eye on who we are asking to make these laws and what are the political implications of that.
Thanks so much, Lama. Something I wanted to ask, and I mean, this reflects some of the questions we're receiving as well, is that obviously right now we're at a point where the international community is demanding accountability, whether it's the Beirut blast investigation, legal reforms, and so on. But at the same time, Lebanon has been the recipient of so much money internationally. We're talking about billions of dollars in aid and development loans and projects. With these same people in power who, we have basically mapped out their role in entrenching a system of impunity. To what extent, obviously they've changed their tone, right? But to what extent have many of these countries who are now calling for all these reforms have actually played a role in entrenching impunity, considering that Lebanon did not have a productive economy? We did not have we weren't generating that much revenue through our tourism and real estate. We relied heavily on remittances and international money coming in. To what extent that this relationship that the national community had with Lebanon, with the same leaders who are still here today, the same institutions, the same framework, and in terms of entrenching them over the past few decades? Whoever would like to answer, please go ahead.
Karim, I might answer that, because this is also where I started. Actually, I started saying that it is because of the conflict of interest of the Western world, so-called, that Lebanon is in the state where it is now. They all played the game. They all allowed it to happen. France supporting its Lebanese allies. We've seen it with Chirac, which was it's like public knowledge. It's Swiss banks, who sheltered ill-gotten assets. It's the UK, who was used as a platform to launder money. It's international money. It's the World Bank. It's the European aid, which was not supervised. We've seen it in the project of the Litani. Where did the money go? No accounts were asked. No accounts were given. No questions were raised by the World Bank or the European Union when sending subsidies to Lebanon or international aid. So of course, that none of that would have happened to that extent without the, I wouldn't know if it's a passive complicity or an active assistance of the Western world and mainly European countries. Where would the Lebanese politicians have put their money? Well, they might put it in China and Africa, but at the end of the day, they're sitting in bank accounts in Europe. So, of course, the responsibility of the European countries is clear and undisputable.
Thanks, Zena. Karim?
After the port blast, we all remember when Emmanuel Macron came to Beirut. He walked in the streets of Jazeera and he was treated as some kind of a modern-day messiah or whatever. And obviously, we were all very traumatized after the mini nuclear bomb that exploded on us. And the kind of emotion showed towards him and this belief that, Lebanon was not going to be abandoned is justifiable understandable, not justifiable, understandable in one hand. But I think right now, and we need to, maybe us here in this panel, we all know this, but I think this notion that the West is this, bastion of the rule of law, the bastion of human rights and accountability, and there's no corruption. These are myths that we need to dispel. We need to stop, believing in them. Because ultimately, it's all about the interests of the different political elites, be it Lebanon or in the West, broadly speaking. And right now, the way I'm seeing it, and others are trying to see it, is the Lebanese state is bankrupt, and we're facing a dire financial crisis. And where is the money going to come from? By selling off state assets. And the Lebanese state does have a lot of state assets that could be valuable if run properly and whatnot. And I don't want to go into conspiratorial thinking, but some documents have been leaked and revealed, and we've seen this through public statements of the bankers or some members of the elites. For them, they're really thinking about the privatization of state assets or selling them on the cheap to kind of supposedly cover the losses. And vultures, international vultures, would look at this and see an opportunity for gobbling up valuable assets on the cheap. The port of Beirut is one of them. We don't know how much, as Nadim mentioned, the port of Beirut was designed in a way that was so corrupt, and it's a black box, essentially. We don't know how much money came in, whatnot, but right now, it could, if privatized, ports is a big thing all around the world, the privatization of ports, giving concessions to conglomerates and whatnot. It's very possible that this is where international capital has its eyes on now, at least in the case of Lebanon. Lebanon is very tiny, the big grand scheme of things, but for our case, this is what we're looking at. And the way I see it, I'm not mistaken, but a few months ago, it was revealed that the Ministry of Public Works gave a concession to operate one of the basins of the port to CMA CGM, the big French shipping giant whose CEO is of Lebanese origins and is apparently friends with Emmanuel Macron. And to my knowledge, and someone correct me please if I'm wrong, but the contract hasn't been made public. We don't know how much the company is paying the state. We don't know what the terms of the contract are. I mean, this is the next step of the struggle, I think. And so when we think about the role of international actors or the so-called international community, we have to keep in mind that there are no good guys and bad guys. There are interests at stake, and the way I'm seeing it, the interests of international capital is definitely not in the same as the interests of the people in Lebanon. I hope I managed to make my point clear, but back to you, Karim.
And Karim, can I just add something on this?
Absolutely.
Point?
And actually, Nadim, I wanted to ask if you think that the reason the international community's approach changed was because of this organization, from the Port Blast families, the uprising, the attempts to reclaim the professional syndicates, the growth of student movements. Did that play a role as well? Just wanted to ask you as well.
Look, the narrative has changed. I mean, and I think this is where we didn't talk about the responsibility of the diaspora and our collective responsibility about the image, but the Lebanese warlords, when they did their little magic act at the end of the Civil War and put on their suits and became respectable, the fact that the Lebanese citizens started treating them as respectable and putting them on a pedestal, of course, those from the outside look and say, if you consider them respectable, fine, we'll do business with them, And Jablat is a pretty funny guy, and he's a great dinner, great at dinner parties and so forth, and they became normalized. And we helped normalize them. We helped normalize them because when they used to enter into a restaurant, they would get the best table and people would voluntarily give them their best table, we normalize them. And why would the West or anyone outside do the dirty job for us? So the fact that we are now starting to look them in the eye and say, you're a criminal, I'm going to insult you in your face, you're not welcome in the public sphere, you're not, I think this helps. Now, it also helps that Lebanon strategically today is not that important. So, the stakes in Lebanon are getting less and less in that sense. But there is an opportunity. And I don't think that the West is just, or international community, if they see people organizing, if they see the Lebanese diaspora mobilizing to say these assets are ill-gotten, you should do something about it. If they see, right after the Beirut blast, right after the financial crisis, Marwan Khayreddin, who's one of the main bankers, purchased a massive penthouse in Manhattan. A massive penthouse who was owned by a US actor before, right? The fact that people caught on to that and went and they put, photos underneath that building saying this is owned by a guy who is accused of XYZ in Lebanon, that pushes people to move because neighbors in that building are not going to be too happy about it, and they might start asking questions. And suddenly, these guys in their fancy suits are not so well respected. So yes, I think there's an opportunity. You can see it very clearly. If you see the way Lebanon used to get billions from the SED conferences for basically bullshit commitments, and everyone knew it was bullshit commitments. Now, the list of requirements, regardless of what we think about the IMF negotiations, they have to basically do a whole sorts of things for potentially maybe getting a couple of $1 billion. They used to get them just by having a fancy hummus and tabbouleh, some smiles, and some fake laws. So that's, I think that creates an opening. Also, I think the Lebanese diaspora and the remittances economy, now it's going to stop, obviously, but because now I'm part of the diaspora again, we unwillingly funded the system, and I think there needs to be a questioning right now about how remittances from the diaspora can be used to build an economy that is not so easily hijacked and serves the clientelistic sectarian project. And that is actually going to be quite a challenge, in my view, possibly even more important than the elections. The regime is strong because there's actually an economy behind it. You need to start imagining a new economy, and that's actually quite a challenge.
Thanks so much, Nadim. So we have a question here, and this is something that sort of sporadically comes up every now and then. The person asking is saying that there are these random calls of sort of being back under French colonial rule, or even dividing the country up into states or some of these federations. Does Lebanon require this kind of significant overhaul and as a state structure for it to be viable? Again, is federalism a solution? Is, dare I say it, French colonial rule anything that's viable? Because there have been, people calling for, even separation of Lebanon to several states, or are these things that are probably a bit too far-fetched? Is there any actual viability in any of these as solutions? I'll leave you all to it.
Just one quick observation. It always strikes me that whenever we talk about a French rule, we forget the responsibility of the French and the responsibility of colonialism in our situation. And I think we need to stop pretending that our internal dimensions or our internal divisions have not been massively affected by colonialism and by Western policies more directly. I'm not sure. No, I think my answer would be no, simply. I'm personally not in favor of being under French colonial rule, simply because I don't think the problem is a question of who's ruling, but more of a question of what is the relationship of citizens with the state, and what kind of state do we want to build, and how do we want to build the state. And I think our problem is a problem of state building, not a problem of colonialism or of federalism or etc. So I think I have a very simplistic question, but yeah.
Kareem, please go ahead.
Yeah, just add very quickly. I completely echo everything Lama said. And a few years ago, I remember there was an op-ed, I believe it was in L'Orient Le Jour, that was like, oh, the good old days of the French Mandate. And the author was imagining how life would be like if Lebanon was a DOM, the French Overseas Department. And it was one of the stupidest things I had ever read. And it was really shocking that it was published in a leading daily. And we just need to really get over this idea, not we as in Lebanese people, the idea that we are inherently unable to live together because we have so-called cultural differences and sectarian differences and whatnot, and we need an overseer or like a foreign power to rule over us. And I mean, the one good thing Emmanuel Macron did in his first visit into Lebanon after the blast was during the press conference when someone asked him about the petition that I think it got like 50,000 signatures about putting Lebanon under French mandate. Macron was really ridiculed the notion. That's the only good thing he did when he visited. So yeah, we have these notions of partitioning Lebanon. First of all, Lebanon is smaller than Cairo. So I mean, at least demographically speaking. So what do you want to partition? Each little qada becomes a republic or something. So it's unviable by itself. And two, we have to bear in mind on how the ruling elites in Lebanon have used sectarianism and manufactured these different identities to emphasize our differences. I mean, Lebanon is a heterogeneous country, yes, of course, as are every single society in the world is heterogeneous. You have different identities and whatnot. Lebanon is not that unique in that sense. What we do have is a system that, a political system that enshrines these differences by law. And this is what needs to be dismantled, not partitioning the country, not a form of federalism, or, I mean, we need administrative reforms, obviously, but federalism is not this kind of magic bullet solution or silver bullet solution that some people are advocating for. And honestly, I find it very worrying that in times of probably one of the worst financial crises our country has witnessed, at least as bad as the one in the 80s, and the fact that all of our life savings have been blatantly stolen from us and we don't see any accountability, and as we've all mentioned, some people are focused more on these cultural arguments and about partition rather than focusing on, looking at this mafia, this cross-sectarian mafia that they're all in the same bed together. They all intermarry with each other. They're all friends with each other. They don't have the ruling elites. They don't have these sectarian differences, and so it's really worrying that in our current context, some people are actually focusing on partition as a solution or the French mandate. It's really depressing, honestly, but we have to counter these arguments as much as we can.
Yeah, and
if I can, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I wanted to add a word on decentralization. I mean, I think obviously the French colony thing, I think it was an expression of people's dismay, and it was I'm going to qualify it. But I think there's a real debate to be had about decentralization, and I think like everything in Lebanon, the world, federalism becomes a kind of byword for like creating sectarian statelets. But I think there's an issue for us to think about decentralization. I think what Karim was talking about, the administrative stuff. How do you create accountability, right? Decentralization is supposed to create more accountability because you say people know each other, your mayor, this, so you'll have a closer eye. And what we haven't talked about, I was an intern in think tanks in Lebanon in the mid-1990s, and we were already talking about decentralization. Decentralization in Lebanon has by and large failed to deliver accountability, with a few exceptions. And it's probably worth trying to figure out how we can also make decentralization more accountable. And I wish, particularly for me, one of the big frustrations is that the Intifada movement, the pro-opposition movements, the revolutionary movements, whichever you want to call them, have not focused at all at reclaiming local spaces. In the current crisis, people need to find concrete solutions immediately. Can you imagine if a municipality was able to confiscate the local generator mafia or regulate it so they don't actually hold the entire local population? For people who don't know, electricity in Lebanon these days mostly doesn't come from the state. It's mostly privately run generators, and they set their prices. They don't even want to put, and I think, so there is a form of accountability at the local level that needs to also be explored. And this one probably requires to tackle things like asabiya locally, about who gets voted in and why they get voted in at municipal councils, and how do you create more transparency, and how do you create real civic engagement at the local level. Frankly, I'm surprised we haven't seen more riots against, for instance, the generator owners, who often are actually related to the local municipal owner. I mean, it's just, that's why I say corruption runs deep. And this, by the way, you will find across all communities. Again, this goes to the point. It's not, same, by the way, the banks that are considered to be owned by more Christian shareholders or Shia shareholders or Sunni shareholders, they all ended up being bankrupt and they all ended up stealing people's money. So, in that way, at least sectarianism is equal in its treatment.
Thank you, Nadim. Lama, did you want to say something else? Or?
So just quickly, I mean, Nadim just mentioned the most guys who are currently running for elections as well, along with lists supported by banks. So I think this shows how the private sector is actually is actually involved in politics and in bed with the public sector and the conflict of interest. And that's why I just wanted to reiterate that this idea of Lebanese exceptionalism, that we cannot live together, that we are too diverse. I mean, I think here in the street in Virginia, I'm sure there are more religious groups than in Lebanon. I don't think the problem is religious diversity and the fact there are too many sects. And I always feel that this, the discourse around this exceptionalism and the need for an external force to govern us is actually a leeway or an acquittal of our local leaders and an acquittal of local politics. So instead of talking today, even if we look at the electoral debate, instead of talking about who's responsible for the crisis, who's responsible for the loss of our money, who's responsible for years of bad economic policies, we are debating ideologies, starting with, are you with the neutrality of Lebanon or are you against? Are you leftist or right-wing? So I think I'm just to point out that these kind of ideological debates kind of hide or mask the real issues where there is a conflict of interest and which show the deep and core interests of the regime.
Thank you so much, Lama. So we're almost out of time, but I'm going to throw in one more question that we have from Muhammad Al-Abdullah. I understand this is a domestic call for change, but I have to ask if anyone thinks that the port investigation could lead to some changes from the angle of international accountability for crimes committed in Syria. In other words, the use of ammonium nitrate in manufacturing barrel bombs that the Syrian government uses. I think this is about Firas Hatoum, who's a journalist with Al Jadid, who discovered a shell company called Savaro in London, who was involved in the ammonium nitrate shipment, and that the owner of the shell company is by Syrian businessmen affiliated with the Bashar al-Assad regime in Damascus. So there's a question about whether this sort of link could hold Lebanese people possibly complicit if there's an investigation into some of al-Assad's war crimes, considering the possible link with the Beirut blast. Whoever would like to answer, we have a few minutes left.
It could be a link one day, but we actually have ministers right now in Lebanon running for parliament with an arrest warrant. So I would actually just make sure this arrest warrant at this stage is implemented. And frankly, the crimes, and Muhammad knows this very well, the crimes of the Syrian regime from its use of chemical weapons, let alone the ammonium nitrate, literally chemical weapons is well documented. And so far, there's been a lot of efforts for accountability, but it hasn't succeeded. So, but maybe one aspect is, it's true that one lesson, frankly, from the South American experiences is drives for accountability can also be regional. And, right now we live in a region where impunity is the norm. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, and the list goes on and on and on. And, as we think about our struggle in Lebanon, and it's a very uphill struggle, we also, as we kind of converge in our many struggles in the country, we should also be converging with those who are struggling for justice in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Libya, in Palestine. Because I also think there will be a regional dynamic, and that's actually one thing we saw in parts of South America. But maybe if I can just, Kareem, because I probably won't have the floor again, but I want to just highlight, I want to just be, thank you to the other panelists, but to just say, there's been a massive, if we were having this conversation 3 or 4 years ago, we would probably be talking very technically about ways of fighting corruption and what should we do and how there should be appointments. And we're finally getting to, the last 4 years, 5 years have become key in Lebanon for us to really realize it's not the sort of UNDP, World Bank led, little tiny changes that will make an impact. You need a political project. And with kind of, and you deal with corruption by integrating it into something much bigger. And that's actually a huge leap forward. It's no compensation for people who are suffering today in Lebanon, but in a way, it's like we've peeled the layers of the onion and we're finally identified the real ill. Whether we have the strength and patience to now deal with it, that's another question. But at least now the diagnosis is correct. And it's no measure of little, we get a small grant for the World Bank to appoint 2 better advisors to the minister to fight corruption, and we'll do a national action plan, but nothing changes. Khalas, that lie has been exposed. And it's no one's fault. We just became real. It doesn't work. And now we're dealing with the real questions. And I think for me, this has been a massive leap forward.
It's time to close out. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank Lama, Karim, Nadim, Zena for a truly exceptional and extremely timely conversation. And Karim, thank you so much for moderating this conversation so well. I just want to mention as we close out that today's conversation is part of a larger institutional commitment on the part of TIMEP to program around the immense challenges that Lebanon faces, as well as regional issues of justice, accountability, corruption, transparency. I'd like to thank the Arab Reform Initiative for their partnership and their shared commitment and in fact leadership on many of these issues. And we invite you to continue to follow our work as well as the work of each of our excellent panelists who you've heard speak here today. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us and for contributing so much to the discussion, because these conversations are made far richer by your engagement. You can follow TIMEP on Twitter at TIMEPDC and the Arab Reform Initiative at ArabReform_ARI. You can reach out for any media requests for TIMEP at press@timep.org, and you'll find this recording on our website and our YouTube channel. And finally, a huge thank you to the Arab Reform Initiative and TIMEP teams for making this conversation happen. Have a wonderful day, everyone.